Hello everyone, my name is Viviane Gravey and I'm one of the CITP researchers working on this project. I work on agriculture and environment, and that's why I'm going to be talking to you about these topics today. So why do we care about agriculture and the environment when it comes to trade? The trade-off we're going to be looking at today is whether the benefits of access to cheaper, wider range of food is worth the cost on food and environmental standards for producers as well, for local producers, or for our health. Now, what do I mean when I talk about standards? It's going to be critical for these discussions. So standards can cover so many different things. Standards can be about animal welfare, such as whether you've got cage hens or whether your eggs are from free-range hens. It can be about food safety. So will that piece of meat or piece of cheese make you sick? It can be about broader impact as well on the environment. Will your choice as a consumer drive up climate change or biodiversity loss, for example, through making it easier, like culling for deforestation? Or will it have an impact on our soil, on our water, on our air? And for each of these environmental, health, and food areas, you have standards, that is, levels that are considered as good. So you will have standards for the quality of your water, standards for the quality of your air. And the question is, are we going to see a negative impact on these standards and on the environment? Now, why do we talk so much about trade when it comes to food in the UK? It's simply because quite a lot of the food consumed in the UK does not come from the UK. So if you look at this pie chart, the biggest part of that pie is from the UK. The second biggest is from the European Union, the one in yellow at 28%. Then you've got about 8% from the two Americas and 8% from Asia and Africa. Now, that doesn't mean it's not as simple as saying we don't produce enough food in the UK to feed the UK. It really depends what type of food you're looking at. If we look at fish, for example, it's well known that the fish we catch in the UK is not necessarily the fish that British people want to eat. So we catch much more mackerel than we want to eat in the UK, and we import a lot of cod because we don't catch enough to meet our appetite for it. Now, when it comes to the environment, trade often has quite a negative perspective. Like, people don't necessarily think that trade can be a good thing for the environment, but it could be. So if you look at the work of the UK Board of Trade, they've got a report on green trade in 2021, and they argue that, it could make it easier to access green goods, green services, green technologies, both in the UK and around the world. But this could, and what is the situation right now is that we know, looking at climate, for example, that while we have decreased quite a lot on domestic or territorial emissions, that's a line in green on that chart, our emissions from trade are still not going down so much. Actually have a bit of an increase in recent years from there. That means there are some products that as consumers we want that perhaps used to be produced in the UK are now produced elsewhere. But when we buy them from abroad, we're actually also importing these emissions. We're responsible for these emissions. Climate is a clear example of that. Deforestation is another. There's a lot of things that we do when we buy chocolate, when we buy biscuits that have palm oil in them, when we buy beef from abroad, that you can have an impact on deforestation. Parts of forests in Indonesia, in Brazil, being cut down. In order of making it kind of visible, the impact, we can actually, pick all of this impact across the world and map it on the UK. And when we do that, about 88% of the UK's land area would be deforested every year through the choices we make as consumers. And so, for example, for palm oil, which is one well known for driving deforestation, it'd be the size of Northern Ireland that would be deforested every year. So that leads to a lot of challenges. Now, as you are now used to, different stakeholders will understand these challenges differently. If we look at the National Farmers Union, we're going to get a different perspective than the Greener UK, which is a group of environmental charities. For the NFU, so the Voice of Farmers in England, one of the biggest group of farmers in England, They are worried about food and environmental standards being undermined by trade deals. You'll remember that from week 2 when I talked about Australia. They're also worried about the impact that the war in Ukraine has on production costs and also seasonal workers availability. Their work on trade has kind of 4 pillars from what you can see on their website. They're really interested in maximizing opportunities for UK producers to get on these international markets. And they also want to make sure that there's not too much imports that risk undercutting UK producers. They want to minimize the cost of inputs such as fertilizers and maximize the number of people who can come and work in the UK to pick fruits and vegetables. Not so much here about really environmental standards, about the impact on the environment. Very different if you look at what the environmental groups want. As with NFU, they are worried that these standards may be undermined by trade deals, but they're also really worried about whose interests more generally are taken into account when we make policy. They worry, okay, we've got trade, perhaps with like we've got business here, agriculture represented, but is there a seat at the table for the environment? And so what they're suggesting is core standards, what they call core standards, and the idea of that making sure that products coming into the UK have to be produced to the same standards and the same processes that those like that we impose on our farmers, for example. So to summarize, the trade-offs we're concerned with this week is a benefit of access to cheaper, wider range of food worth the cost to food and environmental standards? Is it worth the competition for our local producers? That's it for our first video. I'll see you very soon for another video on a case study of pesticides.